Among the hundreds of behavioral experiments the CIA outsourced to university researchers, two produced important discoveries. With funding from Canada's Defence Research Board, the famed Canadian psychologist Dr. Donald Hebb found through experiments conducted from 1952 to 54 that he can induce a state akin to psychosis in just 24 hours. What had the doctor done? Drugs, hypnosis, electroshock? None of the above. For 2 days, student volunteers at McGill University, where Hebb was chair of psychology, simply sat in a comfortable cubicle, deprived of sensory stimulation by goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. One of Hebb's subjects, retired UC Berkeley Professor Peter Dale Scott, then an undergraduate at McGill University, has described these methods in his epic poem, Listening to the Candle. Peter Dale Scott was a subject in the experiments. Nothing in those weeks added up, yet the very aimlessness preconditioning my mind of sensory deprivation as paid volunteer in the McGill experiment for the U.S. Air Force, 2 CIA reps at the meeting, my ears sore from their earphones, amniotic hum in my eyes, under 2 bulging halves of ping-pong balls, arms covered to the tips with cardboard tubes. Those familiar hallucinations I was the first to report. As, for example, the string of cut-out paper men emerging from a manhole in the side of a snow-white hill, distinctly two-dimensional. For 2 days they paid my mind to withdraw itself from every impulse but its own, to look only on itself, not seeing the objects as objects, the humor of the darkness emboldening me to search. Many of these student subjects were indeed medical students at McGill University, and through phone interviews I've conducted with several of these now elderly retired doctors, I have learned that one of their classmates, one of the subjects of these experiments, also a medical student, suffered a complete breakdown and had still not recovered a full 10 years when they lost touch with him. Indeed, Dr. Hebb himself found that after just 2 or 3 days of such isolation, quote, the subject's very identity had begun to disintegrate. If you compare the drawings of Dr. Hebb's student volunteers and photos of today's Guantanamo detainees, the similarity is, for good reason, striking. Discovery number 2, self-inflicted pain. During the 1950s as well, 2 eminent neurologists at Cornell University Medical Center in New York City, working for the CIA, found that the KGB's most devastating torture techniques involved not crude physical beatings, but simply forcing the victim to stand for days at a time, while the legs swelled, the skin erupted in separating lesions, the kidneys shut down, hallucinations began, all incredibly painful. Again, if you look at those hundreds of photos from Abu Ghraib, you will see the repeated use of this method, which we now call stress positions. In 1963, the CIA distilled these findings into its curiously named KUBARK Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, which reveals, when read carefully, the broad outlines of that most persistent, most problematic, and most distinctively American form of torture, psychological torture. If you wish to read this manual for yourself, just Google the word KUBARK on your desktop computer. And if you do, focus on the footnotes. With their elaborate citation of behavioral science experiments, they contain both the intellectual genealogy and the perverse genius of the CIA's psychological torture program. If genius is the discovery of the obvious, then the CIA's discovery of this psychological or no-touch torture was a counterintuitive breakthrough, the first real revolution in the cruel science of pain in centuries. Through more than 2,000 years of Western judicial torture, the same problem has persisted. The strong defied pain, while the weak blurted out whatever was necessary to stop it. By contrast, the CIA's psychological paradigm fused 2 new methods, sensory disorientation and self-inflicted pain, whose combination, in theory, would cause victims to feel responsible for their own suffering and thus capitulate more readily to their inquisitors. Refined through years of practice, sensory disorientation relies on a mix of sensory overload and sensory deprivation via banal procedures, isolation, then intense interrogation, heat and cold, light and dark, noise and silence, and then all mixed up in various kinds of perverse ways that only the experienced interrogator can really do well for a systematic attack on all human stimuli. In its clandestine journey across continents and decades, this distinctively American form of psychological torture would prove elusive, resilient, adaptable, powerfully seductive, and devastatingly destructive. Attributes that have allowed it to persist to the present and will allow it to continue into the future. Let's review each attribute in turn. First, very importantly, elusive. Unlike its physical variant, psychological torture lacks clear signs of abuse and thus easily eludes detection, greatly complicating any investigation, prosecution, or attempt at prohibition. After British intelligence applied these CIA techniques on IRA suspects in 1971, an inquiry headed by Lord Parker of Waddington found psychological methods complicated any determination of torture. Where, Lord Parker asked, does hardship and discomfort end, and for instance, humiliating treatment begin? And where does the latter end and torture begin? The answer, Lord Parker said, turns on words of definition, and thus opinions will inevitably differ. Note Lord Parker's prescient phrase, words of definition. Definitions are very important. They're critical in this whole exercise. When Dublin sued London over this issue in 1977, the European Court of Human Rights found Brittain guilty of inhuman and degrading treatment, but not of torture. Alone among the 17 justices that ruled in this case, Judge Dimitrios Evragiannis of Greece understood that there are, quote, new forms of suffering that have little in common with the physical pain caused by conventional torture, who some must have caused extremely intense physical, mental, and psychological suffering, inevitably covered by the strictest definition of torture. Now that's not 2007, that's 1977. That's a Greek justice who knew what he was talking about because, of course, the Greek legal community had just finished the famous Greek torture trials of the colonels and their subalterns who had subjected Greece to this regime of terror. Perpetrators and their protectors have a strong stake in maintaining this elusive quality of psychological torture by muddling definitions of the practice, just as Lieutenant General Kevin Kiley, the U.S. Army Surgeon General, did at the APA convention in August of last year when he opposed successfully the APA in making any definition of abuse, asking, in a kind of mocking, bullying manner, how loud does a scream have to be? How many angels must dance on the head of a pin? Our second quality, resilience. Psychological torture is shrouded in a scientific patina that appeals to policymakers and avoids the obvious physical brutality unpalatable to the American public. The third attribute, adaptable. In the 40 years since its discovery, the agency's psychological paradigm has been surprisingly adaptable, with each sustained application producing innovations. Seductive. For both the perpetrators and the powerful who command them, torture has, I suspect, but cannot be certain, a darkly erotic appeal. Even when torture was initially intended for a few Soviet spies or a few top al-Qaeda commanders, it soon spreads in two directions: rapid proliferation to the torture of the many, and an inexorable escalation in the scale of brutality. So seductive is torture's appeal that the powerful will always concoct rationales to preserve their prerogative of torture in defiance of all evidence of ineffectiveness in interrogation and enormously high political costs.